Welcome to a lecture on democratic regimes covering Chapter 5 of your Essentials of Comparative Politics textbook. We want to start out by defining democracy. In defining democracy, we may go back to the origins of the word. The original Greek, demos, refers to the common people, and kratia means power or rule. So taken literally, democracy is a system in which political power resides with the people. In the modern era, democracy takes on many forms, but all democracies have a few core things in common. These regimes all include public participation, political competition, and liberty or limits on power as core features of the regime. Liberal democracies are political systems that promote participation, competition, and liberty, and also emphasize individual rights and freedoms. When we talk about democracies in the modern era, these are the countries that we are referring to. Many non-democratic countries, such as Russia and Iran, have elections, but they would not be considered true democracies. Certain elements of participation, competition, or liberty are fundamentally broken. These systems are sometimes referred to as illiberal or hybrid democracies, and some scholars call them electoral democracies, meaning that holding elections is all that they do. These systems will be discussed more in Chapter 6 when we talk about non-democratic regimes. So let's take a look at the origins of democracy. Rather than evolving in a direct line from ancient Greece, specifically the city-state of Athens, democratic government has risen and fallen over the centuries, and over time it has taken multiple forms. One subvariant of indirect democracy, which originated in the Roman Republic, is republicanism, which emphasizes separation of powers within a state and the representation of the public through elected officials. Ancient Greece practiced direct democracy, while Rome was an indirect democracy, with some exceptions like referendums. Most modern democracy is governed using indirect democracy. Democracy tends to develop in fits and starts. After Rome becomes a dictatorship, the Roman Republic ends in 27 BC. The next major development will take place over a millennium later. The modern era of democracy begins with the United Kingdom's slow transition to democracy. This evolution began with the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215. By limiting the power of the monarch and ensuring certain rights to the aristocracy, it laid the groundwork for what we would now term a limited government, due process before the law, which was one of the earliest civil liberties, and of course, legislative rule. The full title of the document is Magna Carta Libertatum, which translates as the Great Charter of Freedoms, and was essentially a peace treaty signed by King John of England and the barons that had challenged his power. King John died the following year, and his son began revoking some of the key elements of the Magna Carta. While the document itself may not have lasted as long as they would have liked, the ideas behind it would have a lasting impact on the path toward democracy in the United Kingdom and, of course, its former colonies, including the United States. The American Revolution, in many respects, was inspired by many of its principles, and the American Constitution drew heavily from its ideas. The idea that monarchy, state power, should be limited would eventually give shape to the ideology of liberalism, which also originated in the United Kingdom. A number of comparative politics scholars study why some countries become democracies while others do not. They also try to understand when these countries are likely to make a transition to democratic government, or what we call democratization. This section overviews some big ideas regarding some major theoretic causes. So reflecting the major subsections in the text, there are more details on each of these factors in the next few slides. The factors of modernization, of elites, civil society, international relations, and political culture, and their impact on possible explanations for democratization. Modernization scholars emphasize that the societal transformation that coincide with economic modernization led a country's population to put more pressure on the government to reform and adopt liberal democratic governance. Many current democracies are listed among the world's wealthiest countries, and many wealthy countries, such as the United States, the United Kingdom, or Germany, are also democratic. However, this theory has fallen out of favor since the 1970s, in part due to empirical evidence. India is a good example of a democracy that emerged prior to modernization of that country. And other countries, China most recently, have shown that modernization is possible without democratization. Other examples of countries that modernize without becoming democracies include Latin American states through the 1980s, though many are now democracies, several East Asian states, including Malaysia and Singapore, and many Middle Eastern and West African states that have become wealthier by selling oil and other natural resources, but yet are not yet democratic. Considering that recent work has linked democratization to growth, it is possible that the causal argument is reversed in modernization theory. Democratization may have led to greater wealth. A second economic argument here, and one generally preferred over modernization theory for most democracy scholars, is that elites are not just a country's formal leaders, they also include wealthy individuals who benefit from non-democratic regimes and then help to fund it. If they see that they will be just as well off or better under a democracy, they will in fact support a change toward democratization. Elites are not always resistant to democracy. In fact, they might support it under certain conditions that give the elite feelings of security. The democratic transition might be negotiated in a way where elites cede political power, but their wealth is protected by the new government. And you can see this in the democratic transitions of South Africa and Chile in the modern era. Or elites might support democracy if it grants them international support and or governing legitimacy from key allies. And this is what we see in Taiwan, which gains much of its legitimacy from the support of key allies. A civil society refers to organizations that are not part of the state. These may include bowling clubs, religious institutions, labor unions, or any other kind of community organization. Non-democratic governments are aware of the risks of emerging civil societies, and democracy promoters often celebrate the power of civil society when it is unleashed within a non-democratic state. The world watched as civil society groups led to the end of communism in the late 1980s, leading to democracy in Eastern Europe. And again in the early 2010s as protests emerged across the Arab world, resulting in initially Tunisia's democratic transition. Non-democratic leaders sometimes take an active role trying to limit or capture civil society as a way of preventing such challenges to their authority. China, as an example, limits the activities of environmental or religious groups, even when they are not explicitly political. The impact of international actors depends on a number of factors as well, including how connected a country is to the outside world. International actors have little influence on North Korea, for instance, because of its international isolation. And China, with its vast size of economic resources, can also limit the effectiveness of international actors within their civil society. States and international governmental organizations are not the only ones who might promote democracy. One international non-governmental organization that actively promotes pro-democracy revolutions is the Belgrade-based Canvas, which was founded by protesters, many of whom were at the time college students who successfully overthrew Serbia's Slobodan Milosevic. And the group helped train the Tunisian and Egyptian protesters beginning in 2009. So this training would influence the tactics employed by these local groups during Sudan's transition to democracy between 2019 and 2021, although that was interrupted by a military coup. And of course, these tactics employed also supported the 2010-2011 Arab Spring. At least in Sudan, these international actors might have been more successful in aiding democratic transition if they weren't competing with non-democratic actors such as Russia's Wagner Group, which was a military organization that was private but supported and backed by the Russian government. Many people used to argue that democracy required Western values to function properly. While you often hear these arguments in the press or among Western politicians, many modern political scientists feel uncomfortable with these arguments. Democracy has spread to many countries around the world, and each major global region has at least one democracy. Japan and South Korea are famous examples of non-Western democracies, as is Tunisia, an Islamic Arab democracy. Most political science would argue today that there are no democratic or undemocratic cultures. That instead, culture shapes the form of democracy a country decides to adopt when it makes this transition. Individualism is seen as particularly a Western value, and it may push countries to prioritize the freedom and competition aspects of democracy. Societies whose cultures prioritize the community may instead build democracies emphasizing the equality and consensus building aspects of democracy. So here we have a photo or a caption that says workers at a technology manufacturing facility in Hsinchu, Taiwan, where electronics manufacturing constitutes a substantial share of exports. Some have argued that modernization pushed the public toward democracy. So in the Institutions in Action feature of this chapter, Chapter 5, the authors discuss the factors explaining democratization in Asia. This is a region that most scholars used to consider an area resistant to democratization. Those scholars typically relied on a cultural explanation, often referred to as the Asian values argument. However, over the last 3 decades, we have seen democratization in Taiwan, South Korea, and the Philippines, though the Philippines has seen democratic backsliding in recent years. The major explanations for these democratization gains include, 1, economic modernization leading to a better educated, more politically aware, as a result, middle-class population willing to challenge traditional authority. 2, an active civil society that engages, pushing for democratic reforms within the country. 3, low levels of inequality coincided with elites who were less threatened by democracy and therefore more willing to institute reforms or accept reforms that were happening. International pressures are the 4th one. So international pressures from the United States and international non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that support civil society and push for democratic reforms. The big outlier is China, which by some indicators seemed primed for democratization. The Chinese government has resisted such efforts thus far. Growing inequality and increasing concentration of wealth in the hands of party elites means they have a strong incentive to stay in power, which has already been evidenced by that 1989 crackdown in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. While democracies vary greatly in what form these institutions take and how much power they have, all liberal democracies possess these main 3 branches of government. There are details on each of these institutions in the next few slides. The most prominent political office in any democracy is the executive. This tends to be the office we most associate with an individual and is the one we view as leading, quote unquote, the country. However, the executive may be divided into 2 key roles, and these roles might actually be shared by different people. And those 2 roles being the head of state and the head of government. Head of state being the executive role that symbolizes and represents the people, both nationally and internationally. And then the head of government, the executive role that deals with the everyday tasks of running the state, such as formulating and executing domestic policy. So in the United Kingdom, the head of state is King Charles, and then the head of government, the Prime Minister. Constitutional monarchies, such as the UK or Norway, Sweden, the Netherlands, Denmark, have a monarch who plays a largely symbolic and non-political role. As a parliamentary system as well, Germany may have a president, but that role is also largely symbolic. It's the chancellor who is really in charge of leading the government. The United States is a presidential system, meaning the presidency holds both positions. So the president of the United States is both the symbolic leader as well as the leader of government. South Africa is a bit of a hybrid. It has a parliamentary system, The executive is elected, however, by the legislature, not by the people. But the president also serves both as head of state and head of government. Here's a fun fact. Historically, tricameral or three chambers and tetracamber or chamber legislators existed, but there are none of these today. Often each chamber would represent a distinct social class. But now we have legislatures that are mostly in the bicameral or unicameral structure. Bicameral systems where the legislature is composed of two houses. Common in larger, more diverse countries, and often related to federalism. And houses may be elected using different rules, such as in the United States, we have a bicameral system where our House of Representatives are elected by different rules, 2-year terms, directly elected by districts based on population, and the Senate, which is elected for 6-year terms that are staggered every 2 years among 1/3 of the Senate. And then, of course, they are elected as a statewide representative in the U.S. Senate. Unicameral systems are legislative systems composed of just one house, and they're often common in smaller, homogeneous countries, and often more common in unitary governments rather than larger federal governments. So here are a few countries' examples. The UK is an interesting case. While it's bicameral, the House of Lords, the upper house, has a very limited policymaking role. The House of Commons has that role, but almost all lawmaking is done in that lower house. We also see something interesting in UK developing. As a unitary government, they have devolved some power to decision-making at the local level in Northern Ireland, for example, but also in Wales and in Scotland, where Scotland now has its own Scottish Parliament, similar in some respects to a state government in the United States, but not entirely separate in its power structure when it comes to ruling in a unitary state that is the United Kingdom, just slightly devolved. Members of Parliament, or what we might call MPs, are chosen in a number of different ways in different democracies. In France, senators are chosen by grand electors, themselves mainly elected officials. In Germany, members of the Bundesrat are appointed by state governments. Germany has a federal system similar to the United States. In the United Kingdom, Lords used to be a hereditary position, but this was phased out following the Labour Party reforms of the late 1990s. However, the current House of Lords is still appointed and not elected. Sometimes states may decide to switch how their parliaments are elected. For example, the United States Senate was originally composed of appointments by state governments. It was only in 1913, with the official adoption of our 17th Amendment, that U.S. voters were allowed to directly elect their senators. So, how these judiciaries functions also varies greatly from democracy to democracy. So the judiciary is a branch of government that maintains and upholds the rule of law. The rule of law being that system in which all individuals and groups, including those in government, are subject to the law, irrespective of their power or their authority. Rule of law is necessary as a component of liberal democracy. At the core, this body of law is a country's constitution and the courts. Justice is dedicated to upholding this law. So in the United States, our Constitution is the supreme law of the land. It is the final arbiter of the disputes that we may have over the implementation of or the adjudication of law in our lower courts. The Constitution is what our Supreme Court analyzes in order to provide determinations on cases, and therefore setting further precedent in support of the rule of law under our Constitution. Almost all democracies have a constitutional court, a special type of court that is given the ability to rule on whether laws are constitutional or overturn them if they are not. This is a power we commonly know as judicial review. Sometimes this constitutional court is also the highest court of appeals, like I mentioned, the United States Supreme Court. Other countries separate their constitutional and appellate court systems. Germany, France, and South Korea have two high courts, one for reviewing legislation, a constitutional court, and one for handling appeals from lower courts. One country that has traditionally lacked a constitutional court is the United Kingdom, though this is beginning to change as a result of their 2009 judicial reforms. The UK practices a legal philosophy known as parliamentary sovereignty, meaning that while local laws can be declared unconstitutional, no court can overturn a law passed by the national parliament. Even with recent reforms, judicial review in the UK remains much weaker than in many other democracies. British courts can rule Parliament's law as incompatible with European Union law, which is less relevant now that the UK is has left the European Union, what we call Brexit, or other treaty obligations that they may have with other countries. But unlike with the US Supreme Court, this doesn't automatically strike the law down in the UK. Instead, the law stays on the books, so to speak, and the Parliament's asked to reconsider the law and amend it so it does not contradict other laws. While some countries such as the US and India only allow concrete review, many democracies, including Germany, Spain, and Mongolia, use both types. In the US, the Supreme Court can only rule on cases that have been brought before them, often resulting from complaints that emerged in lower courts first. They can only rule on laws previously passed by federal, state, or local governments. In France, in contrast, any member of parliament or a representative of a local government has the power to request that laws currently under discussion in the parliament be submitted to the Constitutional Council. So, courts can consider the constitutionality of legislation only when a court case is triggered. So here in the United States, the court cannot address anything unless it is brought before them, and those asking the court to adjudicate actually have standing with the court. The French, on the other hand, can ask and refer these questions to the courts for consideration. So for judicial review in the United States, the court is not checking everything passed by the government, executive orders by the president or statutory legislation by our Congress or state laws that are passed in state legislatures. In comparison to the U.S.'s life term, the judges for our Supreme Court, the judges of Germany's Constitutional Court serve a 12-year term and must retire upon reaching the age of 68, even if that's actually in the middle of their term. So legal traditions vary greatly between countries. Here in the United States, once you're appointed, you serve for life until you as a justice choose to retire. So within countries, different legal codes apply to criminal and civil cases as well, and as a result, judges and courts are forced to specialize. All states follow a hierarchy of courts, and usually a disputant who loses a case in a lower court can move up to the next court level to appeal the ruling. Which court is highest, however, may vary between the countries. Noticeably missing from this broad democracy comparison is a discussion of juries. This is because not all democracies have them. Countries that have inherited the British common law legal tradition, such as the US or Canada, Ireland, or Australia, do consider a trial by jury to be a fundamental civil right. This reflects the history of British feudalism, where judges were appointed by the monarch and juries evolved to give local officials power over court decisions. In countries that have inherited the continental European civil law legal system, which includes most of Africa and Latin America, juries are generally considered optional. In these systems, judges are not political appointees, but are civil servants, with most countries requiring them to pass a state exam to confirm their judicial expertise before serving. Judges in the civil law systems also lack the power to shape law through their rulings, through what we call judicial precedent. So the idea of having a jury of average citizens to check their power is considered unnecessary. This precedent, or what we call common law, and civil law legal traditions are most common in democracies, but there are other legal traditions. Tunisia operates under a fiqh legal system of Islamic jurisprudence, sometimes erroneously referred to as Sharia law, and India has evolved a system of customary law. Some countries combine legal traditions South Africa and Israel, for example, operate using a hybrid legal system, as does Scotland in the United Kingdom, and Quebec in Canada, and Louisiana in the United States. So here we have a summary of the three main branches in democracies, generally following from the notion given to us as essential to liberal democracy from Montesquieu in France, that you have three branches of government: executive, legislative, and constitutional court. But depending on the country, you may see some combination of these powers blended together, whereas here in the United States, following that example from Montesquieu and recommendation, we have checks and balances by separating the three branches of executive, legislative, and constitutional courts. So let's take a look at different models of democracy: parliamentary, presidential, and semi-presidential systems. If we look at parliamentary systems, we see the example of the United Kingdom. Here in the United States, we have a presidential system, and France has a semi-presidential system. The most common executive system in democracies is parliamentary systems. The UK, Canada, Germany, South Korea, and Japan are only a few of the countries operating under the system. One of the advantages of dividing the head of state and government is that it effectively divides executive power. This helps to weaken the executive and allows the legislature to gain better executive oversight, which is a key element of a functioning democratic system. So in the United States, we have that oversight. But when we have a blended executive and legislative system like we do in parliamentary systems in the UK, for example, we have the majority party in charge of the legislature also choosing the head of their government, or their prime minister, and the various ministers of government. These are systems where the legislative and executive branches are fundamentally fused, so no separation of power in a parliamentary system. The executive is elected by the legislature and is often a member of it and remains so during their time in office. The United Kingdom has a saying that their prime minister is first among equals, highlighting this idea that they may lead the cabinet, but their power is formally equivalent of any other member of parliament. So at the end of the day, the prime minister's vote counts the same as any other member of parliament. But that prime minister then is responsible for implementing laws as the head of the government. So to become prime minister, a candidate must receive a majority of the parliament vote. Prime ministers seldom have term limits and can remain in office as long as a majority of the parliament continues to support them. However, if they lose this majority of support, the legislature can easily replace them. Any member of parliament can call for a vote of no confidence, which is a vote taken by the legislature as to whether its members continue to support the current prime minister. Depending on a country, a vote of no confidence can force the prime minister to resign and may lead to new parliamentary elections. As for the judiciary in parliamentary systems, the fused power of the prime minister's power with that of the lower house and the weakness of the upper house means that fewer opportunities arise for real constitutional conflicts that would empower constitutional courts. Since high courts serve as mediators between the two branches, this lack of division means this mediator role of a judiciary, this inherent role of a judiciary, is less necessary than in a presidential system like the United States. So this helps explain why the UK never developed a Supreme Court until its judicial reforms in 2009. So the second most common type of executive system is presidentialism. While several non-democracies operate under this system, with regard to democratic countries, this system is primarily found in the Americas due to the United States' historic role as the regional hegemon. In the presidential system, we have a separation of powers. The executive and legislature are completely separate branches of government. Presidents are directly elected by the voters, so they have an equal claim as the parliament to having a public mandate legitimizing their power. But unlike a prime minister, the president is very difficult to remove, as impeachment in most countries requires a supermajority of votes to unseat a sitting president. In fact, most presidential democracies use term limits just to guarantee that one person does not hold on to this office for too long and break the system. But going back to the notion of impeachment and the removal, as we do here in the House, and then a removal by the Senate, having a supermajority of votes to unseat a sitting president is important. Otherwise, it could lead to simple political coups d'etats using a political process, rather than holding a president who has been elected by the people accountable for living up to their constitutional oath of office and not engaging in corruption and violations of law. So while presidents may seem very powerful when it comes to legislating in a democracy, a prime minister has a more direct influence. Prime ministers have the power to write laws and are expected to take the lead in pushing legislation. Minus some special exceptions, the typical role of a president in legislating allows them to suggest ideas. But it's the parliament, or in the United States, our Congress, which is an independent branch that has that mandate and the leadership of its own on legislation. They can ignore the president and they can pursue their own agenda. Presidents then have the choice of accepting what the legislative branch has passed or by vetoing it. However, the power to say yes or no on something is going to be considerably weaker than the ability to shape the details of a law. An alternative way of presenting the information that we just discussed in the previous two slides. Here we have the slide that puts the two systems side by side and compares them. A prime minister is much easier to replace than a president. A president serves for fixed terms, like a 4 or 6 year presidential term, which is most common among many democracies, and can only be removed from office under extreme conditions. In the United States, for instance, impeachment requires a majority vote from the House to open an investigation, followed by 2/3 vote in the Senate to actually remove the president from office. So our House of Representatives, in a sense, acts like the grand jury, laying down the articles of impeachment or indictments against the president. And it is the Senate that acts as the court for the president. And with 2/3 vote, a president could be removed from office if considered guilty on the impeached offenses. In contrast, a prime minister can be replaced by any other member of their party at any time. In the UK, for instance, the United Kingdom, half of prime ministers in the last century were replaced without holding a general election. They simply resigned, and a new member of the party was elected by their party to be their prime minister. In addition, parliamentary systems have more fluid election cycles. So unlike presidential system, which, barring some unique circumstances, only holds an election at the end of the mandated term length, parliamentary systems may also hold an election if the parliament passes a vote of no confidence or if the prime minister calls for new elections. Here in the United States, we have set our elections every 2 years for Congress and then every 4 years for President and Congress. In parliamentary systems, the executive and legislative branches are fused, meaning that the prime minister is both head of state and also a member of the legislature. Prime ministers are sometimes referred to as first among equals, as we said, capturing the idea that they may lead the parliament but are ultimately beholden to the institution and its members. So let's take a look at semi-presidential systems. France developed this system of executive rule in their Fifth Republic, their fifth attempt at a democratic constitution. And it places the president in a lead role with the prime minister as a supporting figure. However, conflicts can emerge, especially if the offices are held by different political parties. So while the semi-presidential system may seem like the best of both worlds, the system has a pretty poor track record. Even in France, the model country for semi-presidentialism, citizens sometimes refer to their president as the Republican monarchy. In fact, out of the ones mentioned in the textbook, only France and Taiwan are actually democratic. As of 2023, Mali, Sri Lanka, Rwanda, and Russia are all non-democracies. Some democracy scholars argue that semi-presidential systems may be prone to greater democratic failure. In particular, they point out that semi-presidential systems may set up a country for political deadlock and political polarization, which can then trigger political conflict. In addition, they lack the separation of powers that keep a president from becoming a dictator and the ease of executive removal, which keeps prime ministers and parliamentary systems in check. Russia has shown, as an example, some of the dangers of this system. Their 1993 constitutional crisis, which led to around 200 deaths and saw tanks firing on the Duma building, was triggered by tensions between Russia's president and prime minister. Following the crisis, the constitution was rewritten to give even more power to the president, and Vladimir Putin has used many of those powers to effectively reverse Russia's democratic transition. Others caution, however, that the empirical evidence is not yet sufficient really to conclude whether this system is significantly more prone to division and policy failure than any other executive system, as there are a lot of other explanations as to why these countries may have failed as democracies. In a semi-presidential system, the voters elect both the president and the parliament. Following the election, the president then appoints a prime minister, who must then receive a majority of votes from the parliament. This dual executive system creates a prime minister who is responsible for the day-to-day running of the government, but whose loyalty is split between the president and the parliament. In some semi-presidential systems, the president dominates the political system. The prime minister is treated as really a junior partner, and even the legislature is considered a secondary institution. Many former Soviet states, including Russia, operate under this type of system. In other countries, in contrast, the prime minister enjoys much more independence from presidential directives, and the parliament initiates most of the laws. Lithuania, breaking out of that post-Soviet presidential dictator stereotype, has an activist parliament and a much weaker president. Finland, as another example, the responsibilities are divided so that the president concentrates on foreign policy and the prime minister on domestic issues. So, in a final summary of the main differences between these executive systems, we see the parliamentary, the presidential, and the semi-presidential here in focus in your textbook. So let's move on to looking at parliamentary, presidential, and semi-presidential systems and the benefits they provide and the drawbacks. There's a reason why democracy varies in executive design. Each system has its benefits and each has its drawbacks, and countries tend to choose the one that fits with their political goals and historical experience. So sometimes countries have a bad experience with one system and then they switch. The United States' original Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, fit closest to a parliamentary design, though it missed a few elements like a permanent prime minister that we tend to see in the modern parliamentary systems. They replaced this with a presidential system in the second Constitution, the current U.S. Constitution. France viewed the parliamentary system of the Fourth Republic as too weak to handle political crises, and that led them to innovate the semi-presidential system of their current government. South Africa was formerly a presidential system, but given its association with that racist apartheid regime in the past, this executive system was replaced with a hybrid parliamentary system where the president is elected by the parliament. Here we have the potential benefits. Parliamentary systems, more efficient, faster at policy making. The presidential systems, direct elections allow presidents to serve under a national mandate. And a semi-presidential systems, in some cases, have the best of both worlds if they can run it effectively. Problems in the parliamentary system is that you have weaker legislative oversight and weaker public accountability and oversight. In our presidential system, divided government can polarize systems and create deadlock in policymaking, which we see all the time, even when we have presidents of the same party as the majority within the Congress, but a Congress that might have a very slim majority. And clearly we have divisions when we have a party in power in the White House and the opposition in control of the Congress, or at least half of the Congress. In presidential systems, you have an unpopular, ineffective leadership. It's really hard to remove them through the impeachment process. In some presidential systems, you may see the strength of the executive and that separation becoming some kind of a pathway to authoritarianism. In semi-presidential systems, some of the problems are really that we have this limited empirical track record of how to properly move forward and learn from past mistakes, but also a divided executive and a strong president can lead to less effective government overall. Another democratic institution is political parties. So if a democracy is government through competition, participation, and liberty, then political parties help assure that these features are operating effectively. They play a major role in promoting competition in elections and in day-to-day governance. The definition of electoral systems will be presented a little bit later, but first I want to talk about political parties, their functions and their comparisons. Political parties mobilize voters, recruit new political leadership. All of this increases participation by helping bring citizens into the political system. So during elections, they articulate an ideology and present policy goals, and then offer voters a choice between different candidates and promoting competition. Once in government, political parties help to organize factions in the parliament or legislative branch, as well as other branches, and help to ease the policy-making process. And finally, when these governing parties seek re-election, voters can decide whether they want to reward or punish them for their actions so far by either voting them back in or out of power, which further ensures that representatives remain accountable to the voters, to the people. While no modern democracy can exist, or frankly has existed without political parties, not all democracies have the same type of party systems. Some homogenous countries such as Japan or South Africa have been largely dominated by one party through their history, though other parties continue to exist and compete. In the United States and the United Kingdom, two major parties actively compete for control of government. And in other countries such as Germany or the Netherlands, there's a vibrant multi-party system that exists in which multiple political parties join together to form coalition governments. So what sort of party system a country has is often shaped by a number of factors, including the country's electoral system. So competition in democracy is a key part of what makes up democracy. Let's take a look at the electoral systems. We want to compare the world's democracies, and you can see there are a lot of different ways for votes to be transformed into seats in parliament or in their legislative branch. And these various systems can be organized into a few bigger categories. We can compare these categories by who the voter is, who the voter is selecting, whether it's candidates or political parties, or by how many representatives are chosen from each constituency, giving us that electoral district magnitude or the number of members of parliament representing each constituency, and by the vote calculation used to determine the winner. So participation is obviously important in democracy. One of the most basic ways in which the public participates in politics is through voting and through the election cycles that they run through. Voters can also participate in political decisions by participating in a referendum and other initiatives where they can actually vote on legislation. And the two main types of electoral systems are single-member districts or proportional representation. Most of the democratic countries today use proportional representation. Many use a mix of the single-member districts and the proportional representation. Canada, the US, India, Nigeria, and several other former British colonies use the single-member districts. Other former British colonies used to use the single-member district, but have since switched to the proportional representation system. Countries like South Africa or New Zealand, which has a mixed member proportional system. We'll go into that a bit later. A key difference between first past the post, also known as a plurality elections, are majority-based SMD systems, like runoff. Like a runoff is that in a FPTP, or this first past the post, the candidate with the most votes wins, even if that amount is less than 50%. As a result, the winning candidate might actually represent a minority of voters. British, American, and Canadian voters will be familiar with this because we use that system. In America, you can get elected to the Congress and do not have to have 50%. So we have a first past the post SMD system. The 2019 British election was an excellent example of how disproportional FPTP systems may be. The Conservative Party was significantly overrepresented, receiving 12% more seats in Parliament than they received in votes. So, in comparison, the smaller Liberal Democrats and Green parties were significantly underrepresented. Even when districts are drawn fairly and avoid any kind of partisan favoritism, as is the case in the UK, disproportional results can still occur because these systems represent only the largest groups in each region, not necessarily the largest groups nationally. This helps explain why the Scottish National Party, which has a small national presence but are regionally concentrated, wins so many more seats than the Liberal Democrats, who have a solid national presence but whose members are dispersed widely throughout the United Kingdom. So they do less well electorally as a result. Majority systems require the winning candidate to receive a majority of votes. A common way of doing this is by holding runoff elections. So in this system, elections are held in 2 rounds. In the first round, all eligible candidates are allowed to compete. If anyone wins a majority in the first round, the election is done and the winner is decided. If no one wins a majority, which is very common when 3 or more candidates are competing, the candidates with the fewest votes are eliminated, and the top 2 candidates go on to round 2. Since only 2 candidates are competing, the winning candidates by default receive a majority, 50% plus 1 vote. France is an example of a runoff electoral system. A final type of majority-based SMD electoral system is an instant runoff vote, commonly called ranked choice voting here in the United States. Voters rank candidates in order of preference. If no candidate wins a majority, the candidate with the lowest votes are eliminated and their votes redistributed to the voter's second choice candidate. This process continues until one candidate receives a majority of the votes. The U.S. states of Maine and Alaska use the system, and as do several local elections in even other states. The main difference between a majority system and an AV system is that AV rules replace multiple rounds of voting with a preferential ballot, which is why this system is sometimes referred to as an instant runoff election. Australia uses this system to elect their lower house of parliament, which their House of Representatives, and use a different preferential voting system known as STV, or single transferable vote, to elect their Senate. STV, this single transferable vote system, uses multi-member districts. For instance, Ireland's House of Representatives has 40 multi-member constituencies ranging from 3 and 5 seats per district. AV uses single-member districts. It's very complicated. U.S. students should be familiar with the plurality system, but they may need some examples to help them understand the abstract concepts behind some of the other systems. So if we do a comparison of single-member district systems, or SMD systems, we can take a look at this slide. So you see the examples. Voters select candidates, or do they select parties? How many representatives for each consistency? So who wins in a plurality system, or what we call first past the post? The candidate with the most votes wins. In a runoff or a ranked choice system, the candidate with the majority votes wins, unless they can't get to 50%, then they may require a runoff election or a voter redistribution. The most common electoral system in democracies is proportional representation, or PR. So in some PR systems, parties must reach a certain percent, the electoral threshold, so to speak, before receiving any seats in parliament. Turkey, for instance, requires each party to receive at least 10% of the nationwide votes to win any seats at all, a rule that makes it very difficult for Kurdish parties to compete in national elections. In contrast, the Netherlands has a very open system with an effective threshold of just 0.67% for their lower house, meaning that parties don't even need 1% of the national vote to win a seat in the parliament. South Africa, which is has a highly prioritized electoral inclusion to make up for the discriminatory apartheid legacy of their past, they have no actual legal threshold for representation. So, Most PR systems have lower thresholds, and often they're between 3 and 5%. While all the first past the post systems, or FPTP systems, are essentially the same, PR systems can mix and match a lot of different elements. So as a result, every country using proportional representation runs their election a little bit different than other proportional representative countries. The next slide we'll look at some comparisons that might help us. So in the Netherlands, all 150 members of the lower house are elected from one national list, making for a district magnitude of 150. In other words, the entire country is one national district. In the Netherlands, if your party receives 10% of the vote, you win 15 seats in parliament. With the end of apartheid, South Africa switched from the first past the post system to the PR system for the National Assembly, or their lower house elections. However, the system differs from that in the Netherlands. Half the members of parliament are elected from a national list, and the other half from a regional ballot representing South Africa's 9 provinces. So for regional ballots, the number of potential winners depends on that region's population. Northern Cape, South Africa, is the least populated region, and it selects only 4 candidates, while Gauteng, the province where Johannesburg is found, has and elects 43. So if we look at PR systems and their outcomes, and we look and focus on South Africa, for example, note that party systems are party-centric, and parties often choose who fills their seats in the parliament. So you're voting, in a sense, for the party, not for the person. PR voters are more willing to support smaller parties, and with small thresholds, you have the ability for very small or minor third, fourth, and fifth parties beyond the 2 major parties to take seats within the legislative branch. So party discipline and ideology is often more distinct in these countries. There's less individualism for each of the members of parliament. So here we have highlighting the differences between votes and representation in the PR versus the first past the post systems. In the first past the post system, we often show some mismatch between voting, something comparative scholars sometimes refer to as disproportional election results or disproportionality. Well, comparing that with the PR systems, they have a very close match between the votes and representation. Compared to the UK example, South Africa's 2019 National Assembly elections demonstrates that party votes and the percent of seats won generally match up in the PR electoral system. In addition, more parties win seats in parliament, resulting in a more inclusive party system, even if the election results still result with the ANC having the political dominance in the legislature. Advantages and disadvantages, proportional system, more and smaller parties, more women and minorities in parliament, and of course, you do run the risk of party fragmentation. In our majority plurality systems, you have fewer but larger parties with clear mandates and often can have better political accountability. They can, however, be less representative. In other words, we have big tent parties, but they might be less representative of some elements of the left or right in that in the political ideological perspective. And you can also get disproportional results. An interesting question is whether certain election designs may lead to democratic failure. The opening of this chapter gives us a good example of this case when it talks about Malaysia. American students interested in gerrymandering, right, may find this case especially interesting, as it shows how redrawing districts to advantage one party can compromise what we would call democratic quality. Malaysia is a non-democracy. From 1957 to 2018, it was ruled by one party, the United Malays National Organization. They were able to hold a monopoly on national power for so long, not because they refused to hold elections, but because they used electoral rules to manipulate them. They used a first-past-the-post electoral system combined with manipulation tactics like gerrymandering and malapportionment to guarantee that their voters were overrepresented in politics. As a result, even when they lost the popular vote, the party still won the majority in parliament. Electoral manipulation like this fundamentally breaks the competition and participation aspects of democracy, as it means that some voters matter more than others. One important thing that we need to consider, however, is that many institutionalized democracies, including the United States, use similar rules. In recent years, several high-profile cases of partisan gerrymandering, have arisen here in the United States as well. So one potential class debate that we could have may question at what point gerrymandering undermines democracy enough for us to consider the democracy broken. And what can governments do to help solve the problem? Would a PR system or another electoral system actually help? Some countries try to combine the best of both worlds, so to speak, and they've developed mixed systems. These are especially common in new democracies and are the second most common type of electoral system after the PR system. Mixed electoral systems also have a lot of variety. Two main differences are between those that use a form of parallel voting, as Japan does, to elect their House of Representatives, and those that use a system known as mixed member proportional, MMP, as Germany does to elect the Bundestag. New Zealand also uses MMP, the mixed member proportional system, where voters who chose this system in a referendum in 1993 did so following a number of several political crises within the government. The parallel voting system is the easiest to explain. Voters elect a candidate to represent their region, just as they do in the United States. But they also elect a party to represent them at the national level. These elections may be considered parallel because the result of one side of the ballot do not impact the other. So in Japan, it is almost as if they elect 289 candidates the same way the United States or the UK would, and then another 176 like South Africa does. The German system is a bit more complicated. Germany has a rather difficult system to understand, which links the two ballots. First, voters select one candidate to elect their constituency. 299 of Germany's MPs are selected from that side of the ballot. Then the voters cast for a political party to represent their region in the Länder, their equivalent of U.S. states. However, whereas in Japan the results of the single-member district seats, their SMD seats, does not impact the PR vote, in Germany it does. So like a PR system, Germany's parties receive the same percent of votes from the regional MMD district as they receive in their party vote. Parties who won no SMD seats would fill this from their party lists, while parties who won a few SMD seats would fill their proportion first with their SMD winners and then move to their party list. The tricky thing is that what happens when a party wins so many SMD seats that it would have a higher proportion of seats in the parliament than it won in the election. Germany keeps things proportional by actually growing the size of the parliament and readjusting the seat allocation. These are known as overhang seats. In mathematical terms, since the numerator to calculate the election results are fixed, parties can win only so many seats from the SMD election. The solution is to change the denominator, what they are dividing by, so the total seats in parliament. After the 2013 election to the German Bundestag, we saw 631 members. From 2009 to 2013, it had 622. The 2017 election saw the Bundestag grow to 709 seats. Here we see a comparison of the proportional system and the mixed systems. So let's wrap up. This is rather difficult, and often when Americans look at our system, we think there's always a better way, but it can be very difficult to understand and very complicated to manage these other electoral systems. The most important thing to understand is that they try to in their own way, provide for participation of citizens in the voting process and to participate in campaigning. So let's look at our direct involvement in democracy through referendum. In most modern democracies, policies that are made through indirect democracy are pretty much standard. They're done through a Republican form of legislature, where we are represented by a legislative body and vote for the people who are in those legislative assemblies. However, many democracies also allow elements of direct democracy, such as a referendum and initiative votes. For many, referendums and initiatives are seen as the purest and most representative form of democracy and help bring more people into the policymaking process. Critics, though, of referendum initiatives in this form of national voting argue that they put too much power in the hands of an uninformed public and take responsibility away from elected officials. So here in the United States, we often have a lot of ballot initiatives and referendum at the state level. In a country like Switzerland, for example, they will go directly to the people for big issues to be voted on in that direct ballot and initiative manner. So, reflecting on this discussion, the benefits and risks of direct democracy, referendum initiatives are the purest form of representation. They're an attractive alternative for voters who have become disillusioned with democratic institutions, being able to take their say to make the change without having to be frustrated by elected parliamentarians. The risk is that too much power might be given to an uninformed public, which may not understand the full extent of the policy. And then, of course, there's potential voter manipulation. Political leaders will use them to advance their personal agenda. And what's interesting is in the United States, with the overturning of Roe v. Wade on the issue of abortion, many states engaged in referendum and initiatives at that state level, often thinking that in their states they would, in fact, be able to ban access to abortive services in places like Kansas and Ohio, for example. But in fact, the public came out in the opposite and voted to secure those rights at the state level within those states. A number of comparative politics scholars study why some countries become democracies while others do not. They also try to understand when these countries are likely to make a transition to democratic government, or what we call democratization. This section gives an overview of some big ideas regarding the cause and effect relationships. Civil rights and liberties often overlap, but not always. For instance, banning hate speech may help promote equality, but it also infringes on some freedom. So, civil rights are individual rights regarding equality that are created by the Constitution and the political regime. Civil liberties are individual rights regarding freedom that are created by the Constitution or the political regime. Rights and liberties are often present in constitutions, so it depends on the rule of law to be protected. Both rights and liberties are necessary to the functioning of democracy, but democracy is different in the number and types of rights they uphold. Many social democratic constitutions treat universal education, health care, and retirement benefits as human rights. While here in the United States, which has a more liberal constitution, is mostly linked to our civil liberties, or the Bill of Rights, and the guarantee of some individual civil liberties, like our First Amendment, with freedom of press, freedom of speech, the right to freely assemble, and the freedom of religion. The U.S. Constitution has few equality rights, or what we call civil rights. For instance, although it has been back in the news, the U.S. Constitution currently lacks gender equality rights, which is a civil right guaranteed by most democratic constitutions. The gender equality rights that do exist have come about through legislation or through court cases, but those are more open to change and reversal than our constitutional protections. So, Democracy is one way to maintain this balance between individual freedom and collective equality, supported by the rule of law. And there are many ways that this form of government can take to defend both our individual freedom and collective equality. So, looking back throughout this chapter, liberal democracy is based on participation, competition, and liberty. So, democracy can be practiced either directly or indirectly. For the most part, our participation is indirect, although at times through civil society and through direct ballot referendums or initiatives, we as voters have the right to directly participate. Democratization itself is shaped by economic, political, social, and international forces that help us to understand why some countries are moving toward democracy and democratization, while others may have difficulty doing so. While democracies generally also have three branches of government, the chief functions of government, the executive, the legislative, and judicial institutions, are constructed and often constructed in very different ways, depending on which country that you study. Parliamentary, presidential, and semi-presidential systems offer very different choices for the relations between legislative and executive functions of government. And all democracies, in a sense, require political parties to function, but the form of their party system is often shaped by the electoral rules themselves. So if you have a different system, as we see in many European democracies, you have multiple parties because the system allows for it. In the United States, we have multiple parties, but we really only have two big tent parties, which are there because of how our electoral system shapes the strength and the ability and efficacy of a political party to participate in politics. So many ideologies, instead of being fractured into different parties, have now come together in what is essentially a big tent conservative party and a big tent American liberal party. And of course, democracies can vary in terms in their specific rights and liberties and the expectations that people have through the rule of law and their own constitutions.